Hi, this is Corella, and I'm going to talk about something that has been giving me trouble like nobody else or nothing else in Spanish has ever given me trouble. With the exception of maybe understanding the difference between the pretérito and an imperfecto, not in total, but when it came to te quería y te quise. Okay, but we're not talking about that right now. We're talking about something that's giving me trouble. When to use the direct versus the indirect objects in Spanish. It doesn't correspond to English. In English, the rules are sort of crazy, but because I speak English and it's my language, I get it, right? Even though it's crazy. In Spanish, it's also sort of crazy. Okay, number one, the first thing that has to be said is that sometimes where in one country they use the indirect object, which is le, singular, him, her, you, usted, the formal. Other times, with that same expression, you may see the direct object. So it changes from place to place. So what I'm going to do is just give you general rules that no matter where you go, you will be able to understand and be understood. You might say, oh, I don't say it that way, but I do the same thing. You go to England, right? And they say certain things one way, and we say it another. We go to the hospital, they go to hospital, right? Even though it's different, I understand them, okay? I understand them. So first of all, let's look at the direct versus the indirect objects. So these are the object pronouns, correct? Because if it's the word itself, that's not the problem. The problem is when you have to use the pronoun. Now, if you're talking about me, which is for yo, if you're talking about te, which is for tú, if you're talking about nos, which is for nosotros, that's not a problem because they are both direct and indirect, okay? Me hablé, me vio, right? Me hablé, which means he spoke to me, that's indirect, and me vio, he saw me, that's direct. Okay, so that's not a problem. So me, te, and nos isn't a problem. The problem comes in, and this is a biggie, when you're talking about lo, la, los, las, versus le y les. When do you use lo and la, los and las, and when do you use le y les? Because here, frankly, you don't have to worry about whether it's direct or indirect because the form is the same. But here, you do have to worry about it. Now, here's the general rule. The general rule as far as what's direct and what's indirect. It doesn't really correspond to English. The general rule is the following. Especially when you're talking about the indirect pronouns, you use the indirect pronouns. One rule is when the object of the action either receives or loses something in the transaction. But that's a very general, and I would say a very cultural definition. Because what we might consider gaining or losing in English is not necessarily considered gaining or losing in Spanish. For example, in Spanish, I would think if you were killed, that's losing something. It's like losing your life. But that wouldn't be considered indirect, that would be considered direct. Right? I would think conocer would take, that being the rule, conocer would take the indirect object. It takes a direct object. Because in Spanish, that is not considered gaining or losing anything. Okay, now, the direct object, lo, la, los, las, is generally used when the object of the action doesn't participate in what happens to him or her or me or you. right? It doesn't participate. It's almost like the person, it's like as we would say in English, like a bag of potatoes. He doesn't or she doesn't participate in the action. So even if it's a person, the person is like a thing. For example, if I want you to take me to the party, if I want to take him to the party, llévalo a la fiesta contigo, no? You're saying, take him to the fiesta or to the party with you. Now, the him that you're taking, he's really not participating in the action. He's almost like you're carrying him, right? So even though it's a person, llévalo a él contigo a la fiesta, the él, the person that you're talking about, is almost like an inanimate object, right? Now, that's a very general rule. But there are other rules too. Now I want to come back to when the object of the sentence appears to either be gaining from the transaction or losing from the transaction, what you call it, it's indirect, or it looks as if the object of the action is like a thing that doesn't participate in the action. It's not its own agent, it's passive. But here's the problem. Sometimes the indirect objects are used as direct objects. That's where the problem comes in. For example, in certain parts of Latin America and in certain parts of Spain, if the object of the action is a male, if that male is a human, we're not talking about an animal, we're talking about a human, and if it's singular, it doesn't matter whether the person is losing from the action or not, or whether the person is like an inanimate object, you always use the indirect object. Let me give you an example. If you're talking about, I saw her, right? You would say, la vi. La vi, okay? Oops, la vi. I saw her, right? But if you're going to use a male, and if it's singular, because this is direct object, you would say, le vi. I saw him. You use the indirect object, even though in reality, this is a direct object as far as meaning is concerned. This is not all of Latin America, right? This is certain parts of Latin America, and this is European or Spanish from Spain. Okay, now, if you're talking about males, but it's plural, then it goes back to the direct, los vi. I saw them. So one rule of using the indirect object, but as a direct object, if it's male, and that male is a human being, and singular, it doesn't matter which verb you're using in Spanish. If it takes an indirect object, and that indirect object is a male, then you would use le instead of lo. But that's not true for every part of Spain, because you will see in certain parts, I mean that's not true for every part of where Spanish is spoken, because you will also see this, lo vi. Now lo vi can mean one or two things. In the part of Latin America, for example, where this rule does not apply, it does not matter that it's a male, and it's a male that's human and singular. It still takes the direct object, like it would take here. So this could either mean I saw him, or I saw it. It gets kind of complicated. That's why this part of Spanish has driven me crazy for a very, very long time. It can get kind of complicated. But despite the complication, it is understandable. Okay, so what we're going to do, I'm going to make a number of videos looking at when to use the lo, the la, the los, and the las, versus when to use the ley and the les. And I will tell you that sometimes this rule applies to all of Latin America, and other times the rule applies to only parts of Latin America, and maybe sometimes the rule only applies to Spain. Okay, once again, this is Coralla Ficklin at Coralla Ficklin McLean. I always forget my very last name. Coralla Ficklin McLean at istudyguys.com, ipedience.com. And we're talking about object pronouns. So thank you very much.